Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Podbean podcast and YouTube video interviews on my blog, gaudium@spaz22.com. I am Dr. Larry Chapp, and I am happy to have this conversation today, continuing on a theme that I've really been on lately a lot, which is the theme of the liturgy. And I interviewed Bishop, His Excellency, I got to get the titles right here, His Excellency, Bishop James Conley of my hometown diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska. And the last interview was just a week or two ago. We discussed liturgy. And by the way, there's going to be an article in the National Catholic Register about that interview written by me and with a link to it. So the Register readers will get an opportunity to access that video. But it was during the course of preparing for that video that Bishop Conley referred me to my other guest today, who is Mr. Adam Bartlett. And Adam is the CEO, let me get this straight, CEO and founder of something a lot of you may be familiar with, founder of Source and Summit, which is an organization trying to upgrade liturgy and our experience of liturgy, I think, especially with regard to liturgical music. And it is both a pew missal and a digital platform to give people resources on how to upgrade things. He's edited multiple liturgy and music resources. He himself composed, I think, thousands of vernacular chants, chant settings. He's an active writer, teacher, speaker, workshop presenter. I'm just reading something now here, if you can't tell. Formerly, he served as a parish and cathedral music director and instructor in liturgical chant at Mundelein Seminary, assistant director at the Liturgical Institute there, and an adjunct faculty member for the Augustine Institute, and as a sacred music consultant for Focus. And I think you also did something with music. I mean, in terms of running something there with regard. I had it someplace else and I lost it at Mundelein. But we can talk about that. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of your accomplishments, Adam. And Bishop Conley highly recommended you. And then I mentioned you to my wife, Carrie Magnuson Chapp, who reads Adoremus and is part of the Society for Catholic Liturgy. You're involved in Adoremus. And she said, "You're interviewing Adam Bartlett? Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness." So you don't know her, but she sends her regards because she's, I think, very excited that I'm doing this interview. So, Adam, thank you for taking the time to come here today, as well as you, Bishop Conley.
It's really wonderful to be with you, Larry.
All
Good to
right,
be
so
with you, Larry, again.
Okay, well, let's get right down to it, shall we? Liturgy. I've often said I wish that we would have fewer synods on all kinds of crazy things that maybe we don't need a synod on the Amazon, a synod on synods, a big meeting on meetings, as I call it. When in point of fact, what I really think we could use is a synod in Rome on liturgy, because liturgy is still this festering issue and has been for a very long time. It even predates the council, the debates and controversies over how to reform the liturgy. And then, of course, we got the Mass of Paul VI, which a lot of people today are not happy with. You've got the traditionalists. So, in other words, it's a festering issue in the church that still needs resolution. And so, a lot of people talk, and let's start with this. I've often used the phrase, what we need is a reform of the liturgy. I mean, a lot of people have used that term over the past decades. But Adam, we'll start with you, if Bishop doesn't mind. I want to break protocol here. I'm not going to start with His Excellency. I'm going to go straight to Adam. What do you have a certain critique of that phrase, reform of the liturgy. So please share that with us and then launch into what you want to say.
Yeah, the reform. I mean, Bishop, we were discussing this just recently. I can't actually remember where the phrase came from. Bishop Conley, do you recall? Did Ratzinger actually, did Pope Benedict coin that phrase?
I think, if I recall, I think it came out of either his writings or those who kind of published around this topic, Ignatius Press publishers, right, and those kind of people.
Right.
By the way, before you get started, Adam, I want to be sure that we will get to a discussion of Source and Summit and what it is that it does. But I kind of want to set the stage for that by having this more general conversation about liturgy first. So go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, no. Yeah, I think the term reform of the reform and the reform of the reform movement got a lot of currency, I think, in the latter years of Pope John Paul II's papacy, which he handed off to Pope Benedict XVI in the year of the Eucharist. Right, there was a whole kind of movement toward liturgical renewal and a right reading or a rereading of the Second Vatican Council and the liturgy documents, et cetera. So I think that over the last, 20 years, it's been a common point of focus, and a big part of its emphasis really was that we had ritual reform of the liturgical books that occurred mostly in the immediate years following the Second Vatican Council, and then in an ongoing manner for several decades. But most of that ritual reform happened, in the 70s. And after several decades of experience, it's a good time for the church to reflect on, how has this gone? And so when people talk about reform of the reform, it's really about assessing the fruits of the ritual reform that happened after the Second Vatican Council and considering, is there anything else that we ought to continue to look at or reconsider or elaborate upon, et cetera. So I mean, we have actually had 3 editions of the Missal of Paul VI. The most recent one was the 2002 Missale Romanum promulgated by Pope John Paul II, which we received an English translation of in 2011 according to new translation principles. So you could kind of think of Liturgiam Authenticam of 2001 is an act of the reform, in the sense that there were previous translation principles that gave us the older translation of the Missal. Liturgiam Authenticam gave us kind of renewed and revised translation principles in light of our experience, right? And so this idea of ritual reform is something that the church does, that Rome does, that bishops do with Rome, but it's an official act, and it's done through the publication of the liturgical books and through its pertinent legislation. So right. That's different, though, than I think what we talk about in terms of reform and renewal in the broader sense. And if we actually look at Sacrosanctum Concilium itself, it actually uses a single Latin phrase that is often translated either as reform or renewal or even restoration, and that's instaurare. And I knew we were going to talk about this, so I did a search right before this interview, and Sacrosanctum Concilium uses that phrase 20 times. And there's a word for reform in Latin. It's reformare, and it's not used once in Sacrosanctum Concilium. But this idea of instaurare, of the restoration, of the renewal of the liturgy in the life of the church, is really what Sacrosanctum Concilium was after. And it also called for certain elements of ritual reform. And it seems that what we've actually gotten in the implementation of Sacrosanctum Concilium is an emphasis on ritual reform that was aimed at this renewal in the life of the church. That was its purpose. It was renewal and restoration of the liturgy as the source and summit of the church's life, is the font of our engagement with the modern world and for the evangelization of the world. But there's a difference, right? There's a difference between we don't need ritual reform in order to renew our celebrations of the liturgy.
Yes. So you sent an email to that effect before we had this interview. And I remember thinking, well, Adam has just irrevocably changed my vocabulary in talking about this, because I've been talking about the reform of the reform and so on. But I think you're precisely correct. I mean, when we talk about reform, that has a sort of an official magisterial juridical sort of connotation to it, that this involves documents from Rome and bishops' conferences and official changes in translations or rubrics and that kind of thing. But what the council was really seeking this, and so this is the first time I've heard this, and now you've really enlightened me again, that that Sacrosanctum Concilium never used the word reform, the Latin word for reform, not once. That's very interesting. It used instead restore and renew. So maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, because this is very interesting, I think. What did what do you think Vatican II therefore was seeking to restore? What needed to be restored?
Well, I think of an anecdote from the council itself, where Cardinal Frings of Cologne, right? Am I getting this right? Whose peritus was a young Ratzinger, Professor Ratzinger.
Who? Oh, I don't know. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
And this is actually in O'Malley's sort of story of Vatican II and so forth. But
yeah.
But after the bishops of the world voted in favor of Sacrosanctum Concilium, I have the figure here, 2,147, I think, to 4, right? So overwhelmingly voted in favor. Cardinal Frings stood up and took the mic, and he said, what we have just done is this historical moment. We have, just paraphrasing, but enshrined the vision of Pope Pius XII and Pope Pius X in this rich liturgical vision that the church has developed for the last 100 years, with the weight and force of an ecumenical council, and the entire assembly just kind of applauded and have this beautiful moment. But what he was saying, though, is that the church has been working out these ideas and has been desiring a deep renewal of liturgy in the life of the church for 100 years. And I think the two of you talked about that last time as well.
We did.
Prosper Guéranger's and so forth, and Solem, and all the great liturgical movement figures through the 19th and 20th century were talking about these very same ideas. And so it's really unfortunate, right, that if we look at Vatican II with a hermeneutic of discontinuity as a kind of fresh starting point that's disconnecting itself with the past, as many have done, we lose that connection to all that went before, and a lot of the foundational principles, and it makes it difficult for us to understand it rightly. As well, if we think about the classical liturgical movement itself, it was not about ritual reform. It was about helping form the faithful to participate fruitfully, actively, right? The active participation, coined in 1903 by Pope Pius X, in a document on sacred music. This was their aim, and they did it with what we now call the Old Mass, or the traditional Latin Mass, right? They had no desire necessarily to reform the liturgy. They wanted to reform, they wanted to renew the church. They wanted to renew the faithful's participation in it. But of course, that involves an element of formation and of training and helping us to learn the elements of the sacramental system, of sacramental signs that the liturgy is constituted of. Sacred music is a part of that. And to be able to move through the sign to the signified and to participate in its reality, right? So it involves training and formation and like a mystagogical catechesis. And this is a point that I often try to counterbalance that very important work with, is that the forms themselves need to be clear. The signs themselves need to be clear so that they can be rightly perceived and participated in. Yeah. And this is why, the practical renewal of sacred music in the parish is very important.
So obviously what they sought to restore then was a more active laity, a more educated laity, who were sort of really entering into the mystagogy of the liturgical experience and not merely spectators. But that primarily, if I'm hearing you correctly, their focus therefore was primarily on, in a sense, upgrading the music, the musical heritage, the musical participation of the faithful. Was that their focus?
In the classic liturgical movement, you're saying,
Yes, yes.
it was definitely at the fore. If we think of the motivations of Guéranger and Salem, they began by trying to restore Gregorian chant to its rightful place in the liturgy. So it was at the font. Pope Pius X's impetus as well was sacred music. So I think it's very much at the fore, and it's such a dominant aspect of our experience of the liturgy that I think that, even then, like now, we see how important it is. But no, it definitely wasn't limited to it.
Okay. There were other elements. I guess what I'm trying to get at here, and Bishop Conley, you can jump in at any time that you want. Don't wait on me to call on you. If you have a comment that you want to interject, feel free. What I'm trying to get at here then is if there was no real desire on the part of the Council Fathers to actually officially reform the ritual itself, to change it all into the vernacular, to do Mass versus populum, to replace Gregorian chant with hymns of various levels of quality, and so on and so on and so on. If that was not their intent, why then, after the council, was there a committee and a commission set up to do exactly all of those things? That's the disconnect. I'm trying to connect the dots here.
Bishop, you want to take that, or should I
go?
Well, I think I just make two comments. I'd like to hand this off to Adam. I thought that Adam's description of the council and what led up to it was just beautiful and spot on.
Yeah.
Two things strike me. One is that I think there's a couple of reasons why Sacrosanctum Concilium was the very first document promulgated by the council. And this is my own theory. One is that there already had been, nearly a century or more than a century of preparation with this very desire that Adam articulated, that the popes, going back to Pope Pius X and even before, a desire to renew this very fundamental experience of the Christian faithful, and that is worship. And so the very first major document to be promulgated was Sacrosanctum Concilium on December 4th, 1963. We just celebrated the 60th anniversary in December.
Yeah.
And I think the other reason too is that the liturgy is so fundamental to the Christian life. Lex orandi, lex credendi. How we pray is what we believe. And so they realized that this should be the very first thing we deal with in this historic council, which is aimed overall in renewing the church. The renewal. Really, I think what drove the Second Vatican Council was the fundamental call to holiness. This is really what all the documents, all 16, are aimed at, is holiness. Is how do we inspire, encourage, engender holiness in the faithful? Well, worship. Going back to and I mentioned this last time we talked about the Israelites in slavery. Why was slavery so bad? Why did the Israelites want to leave the Egyptian slavery? And that is so they could worship God. That's the fundamental reason for the freedom and liberation. And so this, is why I think that this was the first document. And then what Adam touched upon was very interesting as he was talking about, and you kind of brought it up, was music. I keep coming back to this phrase, and I think it's in a sermon of St. Augustine, where he says, "Only the lover sings. Only the lover sings." The highest expression of love that human beings can bodily and spiritually express is song, poetry, music. It goes back to the very beginning, and so there's where I think music, like Adam was saying, plays such an important role, because it's music, it's song, it's poetry, it's verse, it's lyric that lifts up the human spirit to praise and worship God. And not only because it's the best thing we can do for him or the highest expression of our love, and we believe that it pleases him when we do it well.
Yeah.
But also it lifts us up. It lifts us up. It transforms us, and that's really what the liturgy needs to do. Is it's transformational. I mean, when you experience that, in a liturgical setting, you are transformed. You are taken into the cosmic liturgy of heaven, and that's the goal of all liturgy. Now, I know I kind of deviated a little bit, but those are just sort of some things that were going through my mind when Adam was talking.
I just, if I may piggyback on that and then turn it back over to Adam, it is true. Sacrosanctum Concilium was the first document promulgated by the council, but it was not the first document that was considered. The first document that was actually put on the floor for conversation was De Fontibus, which eventually became Dei Verbum, the document on Revelation. But it proved to be so contentious and so fraught with, that Pope John had to intervene. The whole thing was scuttled. It was sent back to a different theological commission to redo the whole thing. And Joseph Ratzinger was instrumental in a lot of this as well. But I'm not saying this to contradict you, Bishop, but to point out that they then moved on to Sacrosanctum Concilium, and it passed, boom, which only goes to show that there was a certain consensus, a very broad consensus on the part of the Council Fathers about how important this was. And that the basic principles were all agreed upon. In other words, it wasn't contentious. There weren't all these massive brawls on the floor of St. Peter's over this document. They discussed it. They said 2 thumbs up, and it passed with just 4 dissenting votes. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the fact that it got voted on first and passed first is really an indication of where the council wanted to go. And it wanted to go in the direction of a renewal of the entire church via a renewal of liturgical participation from the laity. Anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox now. Adam, do you have something that you wanted to add to what Bishop says? And then we can, I want to move on to a few other things.
Yeah, and I might just return to your question as well, just about did Sacrosanctum Concilium call for ritual reform, and it did actually it in certain limited ways, such as the introduction of the vernacular, right? Was opened up with the possibility that there were certain principles like certain simplifications of rites and so forth, and and I think that another important reason that motivated this, well, for one, the vernacular was discussed at the Council of Trent, right? This was something that was in conversation for a while. So it what wasn't revolutionary per se, but it was aimed at the acknowledgement that the faithful had difficulty participating in the liturgy in the way that they ought, and so they're considering what are ways that we can make this easier and more accessible, right? And that first and foremost happens through formation and through drawing them in and helping dispose the faithful to participate well in various ways. But there's also an acknowledgement that there could be certain ways to facilitate that participation through the adjustment of the rite itself. And I think that the introduction of the vernacular obviously is one of the most visible reforms that people see and talk about, and that brings a lot of complexity, especially in regard to music, right? So I think it's when we look at it, there are definitely ritual reform elements that the church allowed for. But I think, agreeing with you, what we ended up getting probably took that way further than what the Council Fathers and Sacrosanctum Concilium may have envisioned.
Yeah, I think that's true. I want to get on quickly to what you're doing with Source and Summit and where we are today in terms of the liturgical renewal. But before we do that, I just want to get I'll put you on the spot here a little bit. I want to get your honest assessment, Adam. What do you think of the Mass of Paul VI? what do you think of the old Latin Mass? And okay, so just comment on that. I mean, what do you think of the Mass of Paul VI, and is it something that we should chuck out the window, as the traditionalists say, and start from scratch, or is it something that we can tweak by simply adding elements of the old liturgy to it?
Well, there are two ways that I could approach that. I think that my fundamental disposition to this is that, I see myself as a son of the church here, and one who wants to move with the church and help uh, facilitate the salvation of souls, ultimately, and we um, have I have a real obligation and a real desire to help support and work with that which the church presents us. So we have lawfully approved liturgical books that we have that are valid and actually, when celebrated well, that I think foster very good and beautiful celebrations of the Mass that sanctify souls and give glory to God. And we're also living in a very the way that I think of what I do day by day is I feel like I'm often, tiptoeing through like a war zone with landmines all over the place, because they've been torn up, over 60 years by liturgy wars that have afflicted the church. And I think for the vast majority of Catholics, they just want to grow in holiness,
Right.
Raise holy and good families, pursue the truth, and get to heaven, right, and get those around them to heaven. And the Missal of Paul VI can do that for us. Now,
Yeah.
if we just assess it, more on an academic side, I've read a lot of the literature, I understand the critiques and so forth, but it's not really my place, I don't think, to say I'm going to step above the authority of the church to regulate the liturgy. I think that we need to be faithful and embrace what the church gives us and do the best that we can, and to try to achieve the renewal that the church desires in the liturgy with it. Now, I do attend the extraordinary form, as we called it, from time to time, but primarily we go to the ordinary form. And what I love is that my children can float between the two seamlessly, and I think that is a healthy kind of sign, right? And I think that's what Pope Benedict XVI desired as well, and Pope John Paul II, in the way that they kind of approach the traditional liturgy. So
yeah, I think that's beautifully expressed, and I think that would express my attitude completely as well. I often say to people, I attended the University of Nebraska my freshman year before I went off to seminary. So that would have been 1977 to 1978. And I went to the Newman Center on the campus of the University of Nebraska, which was a very, very vibrant Newman Center. To this day remains the greatest faith community that I have ever been involved with. It produced vocations out the wazoo, right? Just numerous vocations. Lincoln is known for its vocations. They all came out of that Newman Center. And yet the liturgy, which was totally orthodox and all the rubrics were followed, was never, the music was St. Louis Jesuits, monks of Weston Priory, guitar masses, and I don't think there was even an organ in the building. I don't even know. Probably was, but we never used the darn thing.
There's one now.
Oh, there is one now. I mean, they've since rebuilt the church. The old church was, all I remember, had terrazzo floors and blue windows. And it was the blue church. It was actually my parish church. I got my first communion there before they turned it into a Newman Center, but that's neither here nor there. The point being, and I agree with you, Adam, the key here is that the Mass of Paul VI can foster holiness, and it can foster a powerful expression of faith, and it can sustain that despite some of the musical shortcomings that we all lived through during that period of time. And so in some ways, I tell people this, I just had an interview with Monsignor Michael Heinz at Mount St. Mary's this morning. We were talking about this. When I was a seminarian, the Mass of Paul VI is the Mass that nurtured me. It's the Mass I grew up with. And I didn't become aware of the fact that I was supposed to hate it until much later when people told me, oh, you're supposed to hate this Mass because it's terrible. I didn't even dawn on me that because, like, as you put it, it was liturgic, it was lawfully put forward by the church. This is the Mass that the church has put forward for us. And therefore, I don't know what a lot of grumbling about it is going to do. But anyway, once again, get off my soapbox. Bishop Conley, you lived through that era. Do you have any thoughts on that topic before we move on?
Well, I mean, a lot could be said, but I think you both have touched upon the kind of the fundamental elements of, I mean, I'm a convert of the Catholic faith, as you guys know, and I came into the church. I kind of read my way into the Catholic Church as a college student. So primarily what I read was, history of the church, going back to the beginning and kind of finding out where the true faith was. And then my introduction to, to actual liturgical life was my experience I had at Fontainebleau in France, which is interesting because now, I think we mentioned this last week or last time we were on. Right now, the Fontainebleau and all of its daughter houses, the Benedictine monastery in France and Clear Creek in the United States and Oklahoma, Tulsa, outside of Tulsa, they use the extraordinary form. But for 20 years, nearly 20 years, they had changed their books and used the Novus Ordo in Latin. And that was my introduction. I didn't know the difference between the Novus Ordo Mass and a preconciliar Mass at all. I was introduced to the beauty of this Novus Ordo Mass celebrated in Latin, Gregorian chant in the late 70s at Fontainebleau in France, and that's what kind of etched into my imagination of what true liturgical worship was, and to me, that liturgy was celebrated the way that the Council Fathers intended the Novus Ordo to be celebrated. And so then, as I kind of matured as a Catholic, I became fascinated with the history of the liturgy. I was one of the first priests to ever get a celebrate to celebrate the right after Ecclesia Dei in 1988. I was studying in Rome, so I got a celebrate so I could learn to say the old Mass. And so then, periodically throughout my priesthood, I've celebrated the traditional Mass, and now that I have the Fraternity of St. Peter in my diocese, I do ordinations for them, etc. So I think that I think what Adam was saying. I think that the mind, certainly, I think of John Paul II and more specifically Benedict XVI, was that these two expressions of liturgical worship could complement and cross-pollinate each other, so that decades down the road, we would see something more, not a hybrid, but a fully developed understanding of what the true renewal of liturgy would look like.
Excellent. I think that was the aim of Benedict XVI, very much so. And before we move on, Adam, I just have to ask you, I mean, you may or may not know this, but all my listeners do. Even though I'm a cradle Catholic and not a convert, my wife and I attend an Anglican ordinariate parish near us in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And I've always said that one of the reasons why I attend it is because I think that Mass is about as close as we can get to what I think should have happened in terms of the reform of the liturgy. Mass in the vernacular, prayers out loud, dialogical responses from the laity, but very elevated English, ad orientem, lots of bells and smells and incense, lots of Anglican plain chant, communion rail, kneeling for communion on the tongue, and so on. You get the picture. What do you think of the Anglican ordinary liturgy?
I think it's beautiful and it's wonderful, for all the reasons that you said. I am friendly with, several people who were involved in it. Alexis Katarna, who just finished up a PhD, she's in Houston and works for Bishop Lopes.
Right.
It just finished a dissertation that was focused on chant and vernacular chant composition, interestingly. sort of did a case study on the ordinariate as well, and so I'm attuned, to this. I think it's yeah, exactly what you said, and yeah, is a treasure for us.
Yeah. I think too, one of the things about it, at first it annoyed me, uh, but we have a full-time choir director. He's also kind of the church office manager, Paul Campbell. He is a brilliant musician, and what he does with our amateur choir, our volunteer choir, is simply magnificent. But one of the things that really annoyed me at first was there's a lot of hymns, and they sing every verse. Right? The hymn could have 8 verses, and we're going to sing all 8 verses. And at first, I thought, "Oh, geez, come on! I don't like this at all." But the hymns that Paul Campbell has chosen and developed, he's really trying to preserve the rich hymnology of that Anglo tradition. And quite frankly, the hymns are just drop dead beautiful, and in terms of not just their musicality, but the theology of the verses and so on. So I also see that as part of what's going on with the ordinariate, which is a kind of retrieval of that tradition of hymns, which was foreign to me. But anyway, I lost my train of thought there. Anyway, so Anglican ordinariate, and I think that I'm glad that you think that it's kind of a model for going forward in some ways. But that brings us to where we are now. All right. And just recently, I mean, Justice Verbisque was put out by Rome, which was a document on liturgical abuses and invalid sacramental formulas for baptism and things like that. And I wrote in Catholic World Report, I thought that's a most welcome document, actually. And I hope that the document has teeth, and that they enforce it the way that they should, because the fact is, there is an ongoing problem in many quarters of the church with liturgy. I mean, I've just recently seen a video of a liturgy that was taking place at the Los Angeles Religious Education meeting that to me seemed more like a musical performance with a lot of modern music than a liturgy. Someone just sent me a video of a mass in Germany that took place, where as communion was being distributed, they were playing the chicken dance song, and there was a woman dressed as a chicken, or a man, I don't know, in the sanctuary dancing around to the chicken song, as people, Eucharistic ministers who were wearing winter coats, were distributing communion to people that were bouncing around. Anyway, obviously these are anecdotal things, but what it is it shows that there's still some work to be done, right? So Adam, where are we right now? What is the state of liturgy, and what are you trying to do? Let's get to Source and Summit here. You are founder and CEO of Source and Summit. So what is Source and Summit? What are its aims? And in answering that question, maybe then you can answer more directly, where are we in terms of liturgical renewal?
Sure. So Source and Summit is a liturgy and music publisher and tech company. We have a digital platform that helps parishes elevate the liturgy, especially through music. Our missal is in its 3rd year, Source and Summit Missal for the Pews. In the digital platform has various plans, and this is a liturgy preparation tool for parish musicians that does all kinds of things that make their life easy, but also that kind of put the riches of the liturgy and the musical tradition at their fingertips. And so we are a resource for parishes that that gives them the tools that they need, and also we try to help guide them gradually toward that which the church is inviting us to do. And so it originally was founded in 2011 as Illuminari Publications. So some people might have seen the Lumen Christi Missal in the pews. That was kind of the first incarnation of Source and Summit. But after my time at Mundelein Seminary and the Liturgical Institute, I kind of had a deep reflection on, inspired in many ways by then, Father Barron, who was the rector, and every
George.
time in Cardinal, yeah, exactly, Cardinal George. And every time that Father Barron would come and celebrate Mass for the Liturgical Institute, he would sort of give the same homily and say, the liturgical renewal and the new evangelization are inseparable. And he was just really kind of trying to send a message. And I just really wanted to understand what he meant. So I dove into that. And the fruits for me is the vision for what now Source and Summit is. And so I've made a lot of practical efforts with this initiative to engage with people who on the ground are doing the work of the new evangelization. And one of those organizations would be Focus. So I started working with Focus and consulting with them and directing music at the Seek conference in 2016. Bishop Conley mentioned it before. We just had over 20,000 people pulling musicians out of the registrants. We had a choir of over 60 strings and an organ, and we were singing the Mass and using resources almost exclusively from Source and Summit. And I think it is a great example of what I see lying ahead for the future of the church. And I think that at the root of this is that we have a younger generation. I'm actually a first year millennial. Okay, so I'm like right on the cusp of this younger generation, but still kind of reaching back, into the Gen X a little bit. But but my generation is in a very different place, I think, than where your generation was decades ago in your youth. We have a young, faithful, hungry generation that desires what is true, good, and beautiful. They desire the transcendent. They want authenticity, right? And we've also seen 90% of our generation exit the church, right? I mean, we have this massive disaffiliation crisis as well. And so what I see is a younger generation that desires to celebrate the liturgy and to pray the liturgy authentically. They desire beautiful sacred music, and the parishes that are implementing Source and Summit are doing exactly that. And I think that they're seeing that the liturgy, beautifully and faithfully celebrated, indeed can be and ought to be the beginning and the font of parish renewal and the renewal of the church. And so,
go ahead.
Please.
How many parishes are making use of Source and Summit?
So that was confidential information until the Pillar shared it a couple weeks ago. But,
JD and Ed, they're good at outing these things, I guess.
Yeah, but I think I'm actually happy that they did, because it, I think is a testament, to what's happening in our time. So I think we're just about to hit 550 parishes who have all, subscribed within the last 3 years.
Very good.
And I had a look as well. We're in about 15 seminaries. The Pontifical North American College adopted it just this past year. And then I know that there are another probably 5 or 10 seminaries that have used the Lumen Christi Missal and hymnal and so forth. So we're seeing, younger generations that are being formed in the liturgy, beautifully and solemnly and reverently celebrated. And I think that it's transforming lives.
Bishop Conley, are there parishes in the Lincoln Diocese that are using Source and Summit?
Yes, in fact, Adam came and gave a workshop to our priests a few years ago. I think that was probably 2016 or 17, something like that.
It was a while back, yeah.
It's a while back, and I'd like to say that we're all using them, but we're not. Some are, and one of the things that Adam touched upon, I think is very important, and why Source and Summit is very important, is he said that after reflecting more in his years at the Liturgical Institute at Mundelein, and hearing Bishop Barron, that he wanted to do something very practical, because that when the rubber hits the road, what can a parish? I mean, you're just trying to get somebody who can carry a tune, right, in your parish. You don't have an organist, you don't have any resources, and so that's why the default, at least in my experience, has been the default is what you know. What do you know? You get these insipid, 1970s and 80s feel good hymns, and everybody knows them. Everybody knows them, and that's what they sing because that's all they know. And so how do we lift them up in a way that that's doable? And I remember having a conversation with Adam, gosh, this is probably over 10 years ago. I think I was still in Denver, about this idea of an app, or this idea of a digital platform, that we can put these resources in the palm of your hand, and that and somehow that we can teach these, that people can do these things. People can, because that's the thing. My priests tell me, I just don't have any resources. We do these things because we just don't. Nobody volunteers to sing. I can't sing, so how am I going to do this in my parish? So it's not for lack of will on the part of our priests, at least in my diocese, and I'm only speaking for Lincoln. It's just that we don't have the kind of the practical know-how to be able to pull these things off on a Sunday, every Sunday, for lack of people to do it. And so I think that what Adam is doing, and as it catches on, especially as you go upstream with the seminarians, I mean, these seminarians that are coming out now, my younger seminarians, they are much better liturgically formed than we ever were, and we never had this.
We were liturgically formed, Jim.
I was a stretch. I know that was a stretch, but we were supposed to be liturgically formed. But they have a great understanding of this, and these young priests, they want beautiful liturgy, and they kind of become frustrated because then they try to do it, and sometimes, as young zealous priests, they rub people the wrong way, and then they get tagged as whatever traditionalist, traddy, or whatever, and when really they're not. They really are not in it for the liturgical war. They are in it because they've experienced the beauty and they know it can be done, and they just lack the know-how to do it. And that's where I think Source and Summit is a great resource. And in my diocese in Lincoln, we're moving that direction. I think we need to do more. COVID we were going in a great direction up until the pandemic, I think. In fact, we had these sacred liturgy conferences, which we haven't had since then. So I'm almost inspired. I am inspired to start that back up again. Now that we're on the other side of the pandemic.
What priests lack, they lack training, they lack the time, and they lack the resources. If they can be given all three of those things, I think you're right. The young priests of today would jump at a chance to implement reform, renewal, like in Source and Summit. You said something too, I think that's really important, Bishop Conley, and that is people today revert back to the song. They'll sing the old St. Louis Jesuit hymns and so forth, because that's the ones they know. I told you I went to the Immaculate Conception Mass in my local territorial parish here, December 8th, and they were singing Gentle Woman, a song that I despise, and yet I knew every word of it. And I found myself almost unconsciously singing along to it against my better judgment, because that's what I was raised with. I knew it. It made me feel a certain connatural sentimentality to be singing a song from my youth. So here's the point I'm trying to make.
Kind of warm and fuzzy inside.
Yeah. I felt gemütlich, as the Germans say. And the fact is, I remember when these new music came in, my father refused to sing them in the 60s and 70s because he didn't know the new songs. But whenever they would sing like an old Immaculate Mary or something, he would boom out the things because that's what he knew when he was young. So my point is this. Yeah, we're probably going to face some resistance amongst people of our age or who are in their 40s and 50s or whatever. But if we can get Source and Summit, just to strategize for you, Adam, but I'm sure you've already thought of this, but for my listeners, if we can get Source and Summit into seminaries, into Catholic schools, as little as elementary schools and so forth, if we can get Source and Summit into Newman centers, in other words, if we can train the next generation of Catholics, young Catholics, so that when they're 40 and 50 and 60 years old, they'll be singing some of Adam's chants. They will remember the music of Source and Summit. And so we're probably looking at a decades-long path here of trying to renew things. So we have to take the long view, I guess. What do you think of that, Adam?
I think you're right. I mean, as much as I wish we could flip a switch, you know, and change everything overnight, that's not the way things work. And even if we tried, it wouldn't be successful. You know, so this is something that, I mean, renewal in the liturgy moves very slowly. And I mean, I myself am already like 15 years into the effort. I think I've done a lot of pioneering work. You know, I'm not the only one. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'm, you know, working with colleagues that are doing amazing things. Um, yeah, but I mean, it takes time. You know, it does take time. And I think that you're right. I mean, working with seminaries, we work with Catholic schools, campus ministries. I mean, you can get the digital platform at a fraction of the cost if you are a college, you know, campus ministry or a Catholic school, you know, even a monastery. You want to support those who are, you know, praying for us unceasingly, and yeah, seminaries, etc. So um, really want to support the up and coming generation. I think also, you know, we really try to collaborate with conferences and places where Catholics are coming and they're kind of experiencing things outside of their typical, you know, day to day, week to week experience. And so the SEEK conference, been working with the Napa Institute, with Legatus as well, and you know, various others, and helping equip them to celebrate the liturgy beautifully. You know, at these high level conferences is all very important. Um,
Yeah.
but I look at my own children, you know, and they have kind of just grown up singing the mass, and it's just a part of them, you know. And I think that yes, we can foster this everywhere. And I think that this is really what the Council Fathers imagined when they called for a renewal of the liturgy, that we would just be, you know, be deeply united to the prayer of the liturgy, entering into these, you know, timeless prayers and chants, and you know, and this ritual becomes a part of us, and that through this prayer we can be sanctified, be united to Christ, who himself sings to the Father, and to be invigorated as missionary disciples to go out and to transform the world.
Yeah.
And we can do it.
I would add one thing to that too, and I agree 100% with what you just said, Adam. I would say too that if we look at a parish and we look at the resources that a parish has, and I'm talking about financial resources, the first check they should write each month is to the music director. I think that's where they should invest the dollars, because if you invest in, you know, good music, and people are, you can get volunteers, and that's great. And I think choir members, you know, people who love to sing, will do it without getting paid. But I think at least, and from the way I see it, is you need someone who can actually do this, you know, because it can't be just the priest. And to get somebody good, you have to pay for it. And so, you know, parishes can afford it. You know, now some are, you know, have you know, less means than others, but I think you should put that as a priority of where you're going to spend your money that you do on your parish administration.
I could not agree more with that. I mean, we have to put our money where our mouth is. I mean, if the Eucharist is the source and summit of our life as Catholics, if we believe what we say we believe about that, then it ought to be the number one place where we put some resources. I mean, I hate to mention my choir director, Paul Campbell, again, but one of the first things that Father Eric Bergman, our pastor, did when his whole congregation converted from Episcopalianism was he brought Paul along with him. Now, I mean, Paul's also married to Father Bergman's wife's sister, so that kind of helped. But the fact of the matter is that we have a 10 a.m. solemn mass that has all the bells and whistles, and it's the most well-attended mass of all the masses at the ordinariate. The low masses are less well-attended. Whereas if you go to my local territorial parish, and this is a damning thing, the most well-attended mass is the 7:30 a.m. mass on a Sunday morning, because there's no music. And people flock to that mass because there's no music. And when you talk to the parishioners that go to that mass, they say it's because, oh, we hate the music. We can't stand the music at the other. And it's because it's, you know, well, anyway, you know the drill. So yeah, I think we need to pour resources in precisely into that. Adam, you look like you want to say something. Go ahead,
If
sir.
I could just add one thing too, I agree wholeheartedly with you, but I think that there's also a reality that the church recognized at the council and in documents like Visicum Sacram that we have parishes that have more resources than others, and I think Bishop Conley, you probably know this as well as anyone out in kind of the cornfields of Nebraska. You're going to have little small parishes that don't have a lot of resources to draw upon. And this is precisely why Musicam Sacram, as example says, that the sung form of the liturgy is to be preferred everywhere, and even done several times on a Sunday. But that was not the preconciliar experience, because achieving the fully sung Mass and all of its demands was actually quite difficult, right? So actually the pastoral tools that we have in Musicam Sacram are amazing. And I want certainly centers of excellence in parishes that are striving for that with music staff and so forth. But I want to see, the small parishes singing the Mass with led by the priest who himself needs to sing his parts with the people replying the order of Mass and the ordinary of the Mass. And just a single cantor can lead the proper of the Mass.
Yes.
It could be a homeschooling, family or a high schooler or something. This is not complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated. To sing the Mass can be done very simply, and it can be done in a much more grand way. But fundamentally, we need to be singing the Mass itself and not singing the Mass. And this is what Source and Summit resources are trying to do for the country parish or the urban cathedral.
Two things. Let me just add one thing quickly.
No, go ahead.
We have a small parish, and I love going out there. It's way out in the western part of the diocese. It's a mother and a daughter who do the cantoring. They have beautiful voices. They sing the propers, they lead the hymns, and they lead the common parts of the Mass. And it's just glorious. Part of it, and they're just a mother and daughter, never have been trained, and in music, I don't think, but they just have beautiful voices and they know good music. And that's all it takes. I don't even know if they're paid, but it shows you that it can be done.
And I make you a bet, Bishop Conley, out in those same rural areas. Well, I don't have to bet it because I've been to these things. You could find a Methodist church or a Lutheran church out in population 50, some city, and they'll be bellowing out beautifully hymns that are singable, that are beautiful, and it's part of their tradition. And so they do, so it can be done. I'd like to add two things to this too. I wish we could adopt as a liturgical principle elements of the Hippocratic Oath. And that would be, first, do no harm. I think that's a principle that I would adopt if I were a pastor. First, do no harm, which means just get rid of the really awful music. Even if it means having masses without music temporarily, just get rid of it. And second, I think there's a reason why chant, and I mentioned this to you last time, Bishop Conley, there's a reason why chant is an almost universal prayer form in religions all over the world, because it is something that can be done a cappella. It can be done something when the chants are simple that can be done by average people. And I know, Adam, you could speak to this probably a little bit more. Let's go ahead. I mean, what do you think? I mean, that chant is a much more learnable skill on the part of small parishes all over the world than kind of elaborate sort of responsorial psalms that sound like a braying mule wrote them.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the Gregorian chant, just by the way, does have some very ornate forms that, the highly trained school, but in its essence and really at its foundation, I think you're absolutely right. This is a form of cantillation that very simply sets the words of Scripture, the words of the liturgy itself to music. That's what chant is. It sets the words of the liturgy to music, which are largely Scripture, the Psalms, etc., sung in unison. Each member of the liturgical assembly has a part to play: the priest and the deacon, and the lector and the cantor and the congregation. They all form a part of this song that is the liturgy itself, and it can be done very, very simply. But it can also be done if we talk about the full Gregorian Mass. You go to Font Gumbo or Solem or somewhere, and you hear the graduals that with melismas of, 20, 30, 50 notes on a single syllable, right? And it's glorious. And it's drawing us up into the prayer of Christ, who himself prays through the liturgy to the Father. We're united as members of the mystical body, and it draws us into that prayer, and it draws us into heaven. That's what it's supposed to do. It can be done simply. It can be done in a more elaborate way. The beauty of the gift that the church has given us, I think, in Sacrosanctum Concilium, in the post-conciliar and perennial vision of the church's vision for the liturgy, is that any parish can do this. It may not be the same every place, but we all can do it because singing the Mass is so important.
Now, is what you're doing with Source and Summit limited to the Anglo world?
Currently, we're working within the U.S. because there are licensing restrictions.
Right.
And we're working with like the U.S. lectionary and so forth. We are working with Spanish and Latin resources, but we're only permitted at the moment to sell subscriptions to parishes and organizations in the Diocese of the United States.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Yeah.
So,
but we get notes from Canada every week, and and people in Australia, and and even Spanish resources is a lot of demand. So it's a lot of work to be done here for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And may it catch fire. I'm so inspired by you, Adam. I can't even tell you, because I often get into moments of absolute despondency if I go to a liturgy and it's like, oh, dear God in heaven. I almost wanted to jump out of a window when I heard Gentle Woman being sung at
Well, how often do you make it back to the Newman Center in Lincoln?
Well, probably about once a year. I go back to Lincoln.
They have this book in the pews right now. So the next time you go, you'll be able to.
I will take a look at it, because I have not seen it anywhere around me here in the Diocese of Scranton, Pennsylvania. I will be. I'm going to be in Nebraska in March. By the way, Bishop Conley, I'm going to be there in March. I'm giving a talk at an institute in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I'm giving a lecture there March 19th. And then I'm going to hang out in the Lincoln area for like a week after that. So maybe if you're going to be around, maybe we can organize something. But I will definitely go to the Newman Center and check that out for sure. I'm also going to be attending, I'm going to be giving a lot of lectures, Catholic U, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I'm giving one at Providence College in Rhode Island in April. I'm giving a lecture in Omaha, Nebraska, at a parish on May 2nd. And so I would love, I'm going to start promoting Source and Summit wherever I go. I'm going to mention it. So I'm hoping that to drum up some business for you, so we can get this ball rolling. So yeah, so that brings me to the next point. How can people, where can they go to access these resources? I'm assuming there's a web page.
Yep, so go to sourceandsummit.com to learn about the Source and Summit Missal, Source and Summit digital platform. Any parishes that are interested in adopting the Missal can request a free sample copy, and we'll get you a sample copy right away. And then any parishes, this is a parish resource, so not just any Catholic who's curious wants to do this, but if you are a music director or even a pastor who want to understand the digital platform, you can sign up for a free 30-day trial at any time. No credit card required or anything, just complete access to the digital platform, and you can use it for 30 days, in your parish and give it a try.
Absolutely. And I hope people do. I hope that, I don't want to sound vain or arrogant, but this podcast is listened to by a lot of people, and some of them priests, some bishops even listen to it from time to time. So I am hoping, I would encourage every priest friend of mine out there listening to this, if you have the time and the resources to invest in Source and Summit, then I would highly recommend it. Bishop Conley, we should probably wrap this up here. We've been going about an hour. And Bishop Conley, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, I just think that this is a really, I think, opportune moment, because, I do think the very we started with this, and I think Bishop Barron emphasized it when he said Mass at the Institute, that the new evangelization will really not take root without a liturgical renewal. I mean, it's you can have all of the apologetics down. You can have Bible studies, and I'm a big fan of the Bible. You can do all
Yeah.
these things, but unless you have this experience of an encounter with the true God, Jesus Christ, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in liturgical prayer and worship, it's not going to take root. And so I think that it's essential that that we continue this pathway of renewal. And I think there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of good things out there. Source and Summit being one, and there's a lot of others, as Adam alluded to. There's a lot of other people who are doing the same kinds of things. So, in spite of some of these setbacks we experience every now and then, I think there's great reason for hope.
Very good. Now, Adam, and I agree with that completely, Bishop Conley. I think there is a lot of hope. Adam, you obviously were at Mundelein, so you know Bishop Barron very well. Is he on board with Source and Summit? Is he getting his priests in Rochester? I don't want to put you on the spot, and Bishop Barron, if you're listening, sorry, but go ahead.
I've been meaning to reach out to him, to tell you the truth. I haven't been in touch with him in a few years, but I think that conceptually he's on board, and I did a few things for him, while in Mundelein.
Yeah.
And would love nothing more, Bishop Barron, if you're listening, to come and give a workshop for your diocese. I will mention too, if there are other bishops or people on the diocesan level, I'm booked to do about 7 or 8 diocesan workshops this year, and still have some slots open. So if a diocese or even a group of parishes within a diocese want to have an all-day training workshop on a Saturday for parish musicians, maybe a Friday afternoon with priests,
Wow.
or even a session with Catholic schools, that's something that I do, and that is a great way to provide vision, inspiration, and training, to help parishes take on this effort.
All right, you hear that, viewers and listeners? If you want Adam Bartlett to come and speak and give training sessions, he is available, and this is a great need, I think, in the church right now. Adam, thank you so much for coming on today. I learned so much listening to you. I'm inspired by what you're doing, and may it flourish. And I hope everybody listening, gets involved in getting your parish to be involved in Source and Summit.
Thank you, Larry. It's really, really privileged to be here. Thank you for the support.
Bishop Conley, it's always great to see you. And
great to see you.
And hopefully we will do more podcasts in the future. We will see. Anyway.
I'd like that.
Anyway, but I want to thank both of you for being on here today. Such an important topic. We're barely scratching the surface. I could talk here for 4 hours on the topic of liturgy. And I'll just end by saying this, that I think one of the takeaways that I hope the viewers and listeners get from this is that in many, many ways, the liturgy wars that we are currently involved in are very counterproductive. Let's focus on moving forward. Let's focus on what we can do. And let's focus on quality and beauty and the patrimony, the rich patrimony of our heritage, and the resources that are at our fingertips from people like Adam Bartlett. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, everyone. And bye now.